Hi, good morning, and welcome to the CaribWebDialogue on climate change, mitigation, and adaptation in small island developing states. My name is Keen Smith, and I'm the project coordinator for the Caribbean Future Forum. This is a series of new webinars that began on August 20th, 2015, around the area of sustainable development, and in particular, the beginning of this series focuses on environmental sustainability. In today's webinar, we will aim at exploring how the outputs of the 2015 Conference of Parties relate to climate change, mitigation, and adaptation in small island developing states. As you may know, the COP21, also known as the 2015 Paris Climate Conference, concluded recently, and its aim was to achieve a legally binding and universal agreement on climate with the aim of keeping global warming below 2 degrees Celsius. Today we have with us Mr. Kishan Kumar Singh. He is the lead technical negotiator for Trinidad and Tobago since 1998. He has been the chairman of the National Climate Change Committee from 1998 to 2008. He's the overall project manager for domestic climate change projects, including the development of a carbon reduction strategy for Trinidad and Tobago, formulating and finalizing Trinidad and Tobago's intended nationally determined contribution under the UNFCCC, development and implementation of a low-emission capacity building project. He has been the chairman and vice chairman of the expert group on technology transfer under the UNFCCC from 2004 to 2005. He has been the chairman for the subsidiary body for scientific and technological advice under the UNFCCC from 2005 to 2007. He has been the co-chairman of the ad hoc working group on the Durban platform for negotiating a new global climate change agreement from May 2013 to December 2014. He has also chaired various negotiations under the UNFCCC process during the past 15 years, including on technology transfer, adaptation, and mitigation. Without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Mr. Kishan Kumar Singh to present us, and please do feel free to use the question and answer box that you will see below your screen to submit questions that will be answered later on in the session. Mr. Kumar Singh.
Thank you very much, Kadeen. Good morning, participants. I understand that there are participants from throughout the region, so let me start with a caveat that I've just returned from the Paris Climate Conference. I'm only still digesting the content of the decision and the agreement itself. And as well, therefore, I'm sure that those of you who may be participating were also at that conference. So let me start off with the caveat saying that I don't intend to give an exhaustive analysis of the agreement or the decisions, but also to take sort of interpretative liberty in interpreting the assignment given to me. So I will perhaps stray a little bit from strictly mitigation and adaptation, but hope to cover some of the salient points coming out of the climate conference and the agreement itself, and what they mean for Caribbean countries, CARICOM, and for SIDS in general. So I don't hope to tell a story as such, but this agreement is comprehensive and across thematic areas. So forgive me in advance as well if I might instill some confusion, because 30 minutes is a short time to really speak comprehensively to this this really historic agreement. So let me start off by saying that the Paris Conference really is a landmark achievement, the Paris Agreement, giving birth to a new agreement that will now be applicable to all parties, in developing and developed countries alike, and will come into force in 2020. But there is some work to be done before 2020. The pre-2020 work program, also known as Workstream 2, which I'll touch a little bit on. So I will perhaps confine my my discourse today on starting with the objective, looking at mitigation, because this really is a mitigation-centric sort of agreement. It can be interpreted. A little bit on adaptation, some on ambition, which is linked to mitigation, sorry. Climate finance on the issue of loss and damage, which is pertinent to small and developing states and those of us here in the Caribbean. On the issue of loss and damage, which was an issue that was championed by CARICOM and SID. And briefly on differentiation, and perhaps as far as I can go, maybe touch on some of the obligations arising out of the agreement and the decision. So the views expressed, of course, are my own personally, does not represent the government's views, if they can be interpreted as views, nor the ministry, and are strictly personal, which I take full responsibility for. So let me start then with the objective and the purpose of the agreement. Start with the agreement first. The purpose and the objective of the agreement really is an elaboration of the overall ultimate objective of the parent body, the parent instrument, which is the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, in its Article 2, which calls for stabilization of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere at a level that will not cause catastrophic damage to the climate, but will also facilitate adaptation by human and natural ecosystems and not hamper food production or economic development. And that's it in a nutshell. So what the Article 2 of the agreement does really is elaborates on that overall overarching ultimate objective by becoming a bit specific. The original Article 2 in the convention text is declarative rather than committal, but the Article 2, coincidentally in the agreement, speaks to a long-term goal and elaborates really on what the long-term temperature increase should be. So it really specifies that it should be the long-term average temperature, global temperature should be well below 2 degrees. And in addition, it says, and to pursue efforts to limit to 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial times. Now, the language here is revolutionary, and it's a huge triumph for small and developing states, who has repeatedly over the years advocated for a minimum of 1.5 increase, given what the science was saying, what the science is still saying, that could pose catastrophic and existential threats to small and developing states if the temperature were to rise much beyond 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial time. So this specific reference to well below 2 degrees and to pursue efforts to limit to 1.5 above pre-industrial times really is a victory for small and developing states and those of the Caribbean and CARICOM, who led the charge at COP21 in ensuring that this was reflected. What it does really is that it not only in specific terms, it gives the direction of travel and sets out a trajectory in the context of the overall agreement on what actions need to be taken by all parties in realizing that long-term minimum temperature increase of 1.5. So it's probably a unique formulation in a global context that has a universal consensus, and this in itself is a very significant aspect of the agreement. Perhaps for the first time, that formulation may be seen in a multilateral environmental agreement. Article 2 also refers to building resilience and not threaten food production, and really is an elaboration of the original Article 2 in the Climate Change Convention. But more significantly, it elaborates a specific reference to low greenhouse gas emission development, again defining a trajectory to stabilizing greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere, as in the parent article. And also as well, it explicitly links finance to such development and such a pathway to 1.5. This part of the objective really locks in the critically important issue of climate finance in the objective of the agreement. And finance has always been a contentious issue in the negotiations. It is a commitment given in the parent instrument by developed countries to provide support, both in terms of finance, technology, and capacity building for developing countries to enable developing countries to fulfill their commitments under the convention. And I will speak a little bit more on that, if time permits, on the differentiation aspect of the agreement. The objective is further couched in the context of sustainable development, because the chapter explicitly refers to sustainable development, which in a sense closes the loop on climate change as a sustainable development issue, which has been repeatedly recognized in sustainable development fora, and most recently in the post-2015 Sustainable Development Goals, which is also referenced in the preamble of the agreement. So the issue brings the sort of holistic approach and the holistic context of climate change within the sustainable development framework. So therefore, achieving 1.5 degrees minimum temperature rise above pre-industrial times sits nicely into defining sustainable development objectives and sustainable development goals, and therefore achieving sustainability and sustainable development will also ensure climate resilience and climate security, if we can perhaps talk in those terms. Insofar as mitigation, let me speak broadly in terms of in two terms. One is the extent of the limit of global warming. The 1.5 reference deals most directly to the long-term temperature goal. It represents an increased ambition with explicit mention and further strengthened by requesting in decision text a special report from the IPCC in 2018 to look at how the impacts of the 1.2 degree limit will have and how to reach that target. So the decision to the agreement also requests the IPCC, which is the recognized scientific sort of referencing and advisory body, to prepare a special report on the 1.5 and the scientific issues related to 1.5 and the trajectory to getting to 1.5. Although some of that has already been done in the and referenced in the assessment report, the fifth assessment report, and summary for policymakers of the IPCC. But this will give specific focus to getting to that trajectory, the science that is required, what is required, and we look forward to getting that in 2018. One of the issues that has also been under consideration in the negotiations is how do we operationalize that 1.5? And it was, for example, there were many suggestions by making explicit reference to the amount of greenhouse gases that needed to be cut in terms of percentages by a specific time frame, which was highly contentious, and therefore the eventual wording that speaks to operationalizing, in a sense, 1.5 really is enunciated in Article 4, Section 1 of the agreement, which resolves to peak global greenhouse gases as soon as possible, and then after 2050, it says that all anthropogenic emissions should be balanced with removal by sinks. What that essentially says then, or the effect of this article, while not making specific and explicit reference to percentage of emission reductions over any specific period, and avoiding terms like net zero emissions, climate neutrality, and so on, what it does, the effect of this language, what it does is it speaks to balancing anthropogenic emissions with removal by sinks. So if you have an exact balance, really what you're speaking to is a net zero emissions goal, without specifically saying a net zero emissions goal in explicit language. So that is, as well, is a significant aspect of the agreement that says in the long term, the logical interpretation of this is a net zero emissions goal or emissions neutrality in the long term. So it has the same effect without sort of quantifying emissions reductions over time that would be required to reach the temperature goal. In terms of adaptation, which is a critical issue for small and developing states and those of us here in the Caribbean, the article itself in Article 7 really speaks to work that is already underway and elaborates many of the provisions on adaptation in the parent convention. But what it does really is that it provides, for the first time, it defines a long-term adaptation goal, something that has been touted by many parties during the course of the negotiations. But what it does in Article 7.1 is links that adaptation goal to the long-term temperature goal. So it makes the reference that or the inference that the adaptation goal should be to the extent that the 1.5 limit would allow. And it provides, I will not go into detail of Article 7, but just to give you the sort of essence of it, it provides for support for small island states to prepare adaptation plans and to submit these to the UN. And more significantly, it elevates adaptation on par with mitigation, which has always been a cry of developing countries in the context of a global stocktake that is to take place in 2023, as provided for, which I just touch on a little bit. What it does, it provides the opportunity for developing countries and small island states in particular, for which adaptation is a key issue, to bring under a global stocktake of progress towards the long-term temperature goal, and by extension the long-term adaptation goal, or what is being done nationally to highlight the adaptation needs, and to also expose or in a transparent manner what support in terms of finance and technology and capacity building that they have been receiving to effectively adapt and ostensibly to meet the adaptation goal linked to the 1.5 minimum temperature increase. And it's all in Article 7. There is no revolutionary issue on adaptation, except that some work for the adaptation, more work for the adaptation committee is elaborated in the decision as well, and as well as supporting mechanisms to look at early warning systems, increasing scientific knowledge, basically the tools and the support mechanisms that would be required for effective adaptation planning. But the significant part of the adaptation issue here really is the opportunity to present adaptation plans, to have a global stocktake on adaptation efforts, and of course to take advantage of the support that is to be provided by developed countries. And I'll come to the finance part of it in a bit. Therefore, it is incumbent, therefore, on SIDS and Caribbean countries to take advantage of these opportunities and the finance that is to be provided to bring to the fore issues related to the adaptation plans and the adaptation efforts and any shortfalls that may arise therefrom, to give it the sort of elevation that has been called for over time, to bring it on par with mitigation. Let me just touch a little bit on the ambition. In the agreement calls for a global stocktake of the implementation of the agreement that will take place in 2023, I think. Yes, let me get this, Article 14. And every 5 years thereafter, or otherwise determined by the conference of the parties that will serve as the meeting of the parties to the Paris Agreement. This really is a sort of global forum to periodically take stock of the implementation of the Paris Agreement and to assess the progress towards achieving the purpose of the agreement, which is the long-term temperature goals, as we had discussed earlier, but to also consider issues related to mitigation, to adaptation, and to means of implementation and support, loosely translated into finance and capacity building. and all to be done in the light of equity and available science. And I will touch a little bit on that a little bit later on, time permitting. Another dialogue in this respect is to take place in 2018, which is could be interpreted as a one-off facilitative dialogue. And this really is a matter of semantics, because it really is a stock take, but don't call it a stock take. It's a facilitative dialogue. It's a one-off sort of midterm stock take, if you want, that will also address some of these issues that will take place in 2023. So it's a sort of midterm 2018 facilitative dialogue. It requests the parties to convene a facilitative dialogue. So it means that it's going to be a one-off 2018 stock take. I'll prefer to call it a stock take, because that is what is going to be tantamount to. And so countries should be ready in 2018 to be able to be in a position to really bring to the fore issues that will be addressed under that facilitative dialogue. Now, let me just touch a bit briefly on the nationally determined contributions. Most countries, most small and developing states, in fact, it's almost universal now, all countries have submitted an intended nationally determined contribution. And this is to be treated under the agreement in a way that will now see frequent or periodic, I should say, not frequent, periodic revisits and submissions of nationally determined contributions to the Secretariat. And the provisions are that there should be no backsliding. In other words, every progressive NDC, as they are called, should be more ambitious than the previous submitted one. It also provides for a reconciliation of the timelines of the INDCs. Some were submitted with a timeline of 2025, and others were submitted with a timeline of 2030. And in decisions to give effect to the agreement in the accompanying decisions text of the outcome of Paris, in particular in paragraph 23 and 24, it may have implications for those of us in the Caribbean and other states who have submitted such INDCs. While it's not mandatory language, it urges parties that whose intended nationally determined contributions up to a time frame of 2025 to communicate by 2020 a new NDC, and to do so every 5 years thereafter, and request those parties whose INDC contains the time frame up to 2030 to communicate or update by 2020 these contributions, and to do so every 5 years thereafter, pursuant to Article 4(9) of the agreement. So this represents really a sort of a commitment to scaling up ambition, to scaling up mitigation efforts to achieve the long-term objective of the agreement, the 1.5 minimum, through a nationally determined process, but with the caveat that such processes should result in a contribution that is not less than what was previously submitted. And all of these issues and the modalities and so on will be sorted out in the coming years and the coming sessions of the subsidiary bodies to give effect to them. In that respect, I should say that a new body, the ad hoc working group on the Durban platform, must come to an end. It has completed its work and fulfilled its mandate by the COP adopting the agreement. But the agreement, the outcome also establishes a new subsidiary body, and the ad hoc working group on the Paris Agreement, I think it's called, which will it's called the ad hoc working group on the Paris Agreement, that will seek to make preparations for the coming into force of the Paris Agreement in 2020 by looking at all the modalities and all the issues that have been raised in the decision text, the requests and the decision, language in the decision text of the outcome, as well as provisions, relevant provisions of the agreement itself, and that is to be formed and come into be operationalized. The other aspect related to ambition is in the context of Workstream 2. During the ad hoc working group on the Durban platform, the work was divided into Workstream 1 and Workstream 2. Workstream 2 dealt with the pre-2020 work that needed to be done, given that the understanding that any outcome in Paris would have been effective only in 2020. So there was a time gap between 2015, the projected outcome of Paris, and the entry into force in 2020. So we had a 5-year gap. So Workstream 2 was basically established to look at work to be done on mitigation between what is called the pre-2020 mitigation on ambition period. And that is addressed basically in decision text that speaks really to urging parties to ratify the Kyoto Protocol second commitment period, to make pledges under the Cancun agreements, and so on. It also refines some of the action to be taken by the Technology Executive Committee, for example, and the Climate Technology Center and Network. And so it's the language in the decision is really encouraging language, invitational language, such as urges and so on. And therefore, it also decided to conduct a facilitative dialogue in conjunction with the 22nd session of the COP, which is next year, to identify relevant opportunities to enhance the provision of financial resources, including for technology development and transfer and capacity building. So Workstream 2 really seeks to ramp up efforts by parties before 2020 in increasing ambition, not only in mitigation but adaptation where it may be necessary and applicable. One of the important issues as well that has been addressed in the agreement is the issue of climate finance. Finance has always been the sort of accepted make or break of the agreement, and it is significant for small island developing states because it links back to an issue that has also been contentious, and that is the recognition of the special circumstances of small island developing states and the particular vulnerability of small island developing states as recognized in the Parent Convention under Article 4.8 and 4.9, including least developed countries. What the text on climate finance does in Article 9 really reinforces the commitments already laid out in the Parent Convention of the provision of financial resources by developed countries to developing countries to enable them to build climate resilient futures and to enable them to implement the provisions of the convention and this article and this agreement. But significantly for SIDS, if for those of you who might have the text in front of you, Article 9.4 and 9.9 really recognizes the particular vulnerability or special circumstances of small and developing states and least developed countries in the context of finance. And this is significant because what it does is it links the issue of provision of finance and support with a specific reference to the special circumstances of SIDS. So therefore, it sort of preserves that recognition, which was hard fought in the negotiations, and which is quite noticeably absent from the preamble, but which in which case it gives reference to recognizing the vulnerability under the convention. So it's implicit. Notably, it does not that special circumstances is not explicitly recognized under adaptation. But the link with adaptation and the long-term mitigation goal and the provision of support and the recognition of the special circumstance of SIDS with the provision of scale-up finances is a victory for SIDS, given that there is now that reiteration of the commitment of developed countries to provide that support. One of the contentious issues as well was the request to explicitly mention predictable quanta of finance from developed countries, which did not find its way in the final agreement, but did in fact find its way in the decision text, and I think it's paragraph 115 that references the 100 billion, saying basically that more than 100 billion would be required, and therefore confirming what developing countries have been requesting, that the 100 billion per year pledged in Copenhagen in 2009 was not the ceiling but was the floor. FLOOR, not FLAW. Therefore, while the language itself is not legally binding, the context of the paragraph in the decision that gives effect to the agreement means that it provides a stronger obligation to provide climate finance, and therefore that stronger expression of climate finance provision linked to the special circumstances of SIDS for scale-up financing gives sort of or builds the argument that SIDS should be given preferential treatment, if you want, in when finance is being provided. And also the article also speaks to direct access and easier and less cumbersome modalities for accessing finance for small states. Time is a bit on me at the moment, so let me just touch on the last but perhaps most significant issue affecting small and developing states, and hard fought by SIDS and in particular those of the CARICOM delegations at COP21, and that's the issue of loss and damage. And loss and damage was hard fought in Warsaw in 2013 when the Warsaw International Mechanism on Loss and Damage was launched. And the issue at COP21 and hence and since 2013 was the issue of liability and compensation for slow onset and long-term damage and loss. Loss and damage meaning those permanent type losses that goes beyond what adaptation could minimize or avoid. And the Article 8 of the text really speaks to loss and damage, and what essentially does is it reaffirms the Warsaw International Mechanism as the primary sort of modality or mechanism for looking at issues related to loss and damage. But more significantly is that it places the WIM, the Warsaw International Mechanism, directly under the Conference of the Parties, serving as the meeting of the parties to the Paris Agreement and outside of the COP, so that it links the WIM directly to the agreement and the body charged with overseeing implementation of the agreement. One of the contentious issues in loss and damage, therefore, was addressed in this provision, meaning now that the Warsaw International Mechanism can be enhanced and expanded as provided for pursuant to discussions that will take place under the Conference of the Parties meeting as parties to the Paris Agreement, and therefore leaves sort of an open door to bring in issues that were not sort of included in the agreement or in the decision. And significantly, one of the contentious issues on loss and damage, in fact, on having loss and damage reflected in the text at all, was the issue of compensation and liability being called for by parties and resisted by developed country parties, particularly the United States. And there was a proposal to have an indemnity clause that that spoke explicitly to indemnification of liability and compensation resulting from loss and damage in the agreement. But then there were discussions on the legality of including such clauses, but perhaps not normative international law, which would derogate from rights that may exist elsewhere. So in the end, the decision, the issue of compensation and liability was reflected in the decision text in sort of milder language, if you want, that says that the issue of loss and of compensation will not be liability and compensation will not arise as a result of the implementation of Article 8. So it's in the decision text and not in the agreement, and really serves as a, if one could categorize it as a good Samaritan clause in legal terms. So it was a neat fix to what was initially a very contentious issue, but a huge victory for small and developing states in the context of that overall contentious issue and what came out of Paris. Eventually, I will wrap up now because time is on me by saying that that this really is a victory for multilateralism, given the nature and the adversarial nature of the negotiations over the past 4 years. I was sometimes on the receiving end of that, from parties having chaired and having had to push to get agreement towards Paris. It is a victory for multilateralism. It is a huge victory for us here in the Caribbean. And let me say thank you to the Caribbean delegations at COP21 who persevered, particularly those at the high level prime ministers, and in particular, let me single out, if I may, Minister James Fletcher of St. Lucia, who stood there for the entire 2 weeks, day and night, side by side, and fought till the end until we got what I think all can acknowledge to be a better than expected outcome in Paris. A really ambitious agreement, because ambition now has to be balanced between legally binding and what is possible, given the issue of differentiation. So with that said, I tried to give you a nutshell, really a peanut shell, because it's very small and the time is short. So I hope I would have been comprehensive, and I take questions if there are any.
Okay, so we have a number of questions online. I'll start with the first question. It comes from the Network of Rural Women Producers in Trinidad and Tobago. And they are interested in knowing what sort of action plan will be created for this country and the wider region for the short, medium, and long-term adaptation goal.
Okay, let me start with the national first, which is easier to speak to. Trinidad and Tobago has in place a national climate change policy that speaks to both adaptation and mitigation, and that also seeks to revise existing policies that may be climate relevant or have relevance to climate change. That policy is up for revision next year, as provided for in the policy itself, and it has been rolled out fairly extensively to date, with the adoption of a carbon reduction strategy, which was used as the basis for the intended nationally determined contribution of Trinidad and Tobago to the UNFCCC. The elaboration and the rollout of the climate change policy will continue because it's a living document, and plans and policies will also be formulated to address the issues. In that regard, we have developed a climate change focal point network that has representation from, I think now, about 175 representatives from NGOs, CBOs, industry, ministries, agencies. It's fairly broad, and consultations will be held with every one of those as we roll out the new, or the revised, I should say, climate change policy, which we hope to consultations will begin next year. In terms of the region, CARICOM has is the entity charged with looking at sustainable development issues for the region. St. Lucia being the sort of lead head on that issue, and the Climate Change Center in Belize has been working, and I'm sure will now take into consideration aspects of the agreement and the decision in now trying to formulate regional plans that will go to CARICOM heads for adoption to be implemented in national territories.
And then another question was that you mentioned a number of resources throughout your presentation, for example, financial resources, and what can we do to really take advantage? And I think we, as in small island developing states, how can we really take advantage of these resources that are available?
Right. One of the or perhaps the major entity that has been established internationally is the Green Climate Fund that is now being capitalized by countries. And to access funds from the Green Climate Fund, there are certain national criteria and procedures that have to be set up, which we are in the process of doing. But given the fact that the issue of scale of financing has recognized, or the context of scale of financing has recognized the special circumstances of SIDS, with a view to making access easier and less cumbersome, it all now depends on setting up the national machinery and criteria to access funds and developing projects and programs, and then making representation to get these funds.
And can we just take two more questions? So another is, in light of what you said, it's similar to the first question, but what is now required on a regional level?
Well, the convention, as with all international instruments, is premised on the issue of national sovereignty. CARICOM is not a regional institution or arrangement that allows CARICOM to be a signatory to the Climate Change Convention or this agreement, unlike the European Union, for example. So there's no supranational entity within the Caribbean that will perhaps have a sort of directional jurisdiction over the region. So it will depend on implementation at the national level. However, CARICOM at the regional level can make representations, as I said, to heads of government at COTED and at CARICOM heads meeting of plans and programs that can be adopted to be implemented nationally using a regional approach. So that is as far as the regional approach can go. Okay.
Another question: how instrumental was AOSIS in achieving this agreement?
Well, AOSIS has been advocating the 1.5 temperature limit for as long as I can remember. This happened right after Bali in 2007 with the launch of the Bali Action Plan, I think, starting 2008. And AOSIS has been phenomenal over the years under our own leadership of Grenada in the region, and then Nauru and COP21 under the Maldives. AOSIS has given tremendous optimism and determination, and has attracted support and gained traction for its 1.5 call. So much so that at the initiative of the Marshall Islands and wider AOSIS membership, with the support of wider AOSIS membership, that a high ambition coalition was formed in the last few days of Paris that attracted membership from the US, from Canada, from Brazil, even China. An unlikely candidate to support AOSIS position was seen sort of making overtures in that direction. So the persistence and the arguments forwarded by AOSIS, particularly in the context of the 1.5 long-term temperature goal, I think they can take perhaps singular credit for leveraging that kind of support and eventually getting it in a very concrete way in the agreement, particularly in the purpose and the objective of the agreement.
There's one last question, which is what makes the Paris Agreement sustainable?
The Paris Agreement, well, what makes it sustainable really is the nature of it, because it is not entirely top down. It is legally binding, but as I said, it is balanced between nationally determined or bottom-up sort of approaches and the legal bindingness. The extent of legal bindingness in international law is ultimately a function of political will. What makes it durable and perhaps sustainable, if you can categorize it to that extent, is the fact that all parties are comfortable with its provisions and all parties have pledged to implement it over time, given that they have now accepted the long-term purpose and the objective of the agreement, and therefore mechanisms and modalities are now to be elucidated and agreed to in implementing the agreement. So that in itself, given the political will that has been shown thus far, is a strong indicator of its sustainability and durability.
Okay, that's great. I know I'm seeing one question.
If we have time, no problem.
We have time, so we'll take this last question. Do you think that the wider Caribbean Pavilion helped the Caribbean presence at COP21 and played a role in airing our causes?
Yes, and I want to thank, most certainly, and I want to thank the Caribbean Climate Change Center in Belize and its administrative staff for conceptualizing and having the vision to set up this pavilion, which really gave the sort of visibility to the Caribbean and to the issues relevant to the Caribbean in the negotiations. And one of the more the lighter side, but perhaps more effective side of the activities under the Caribbean Pavilion was a sort of lunchtime entertainment of singers and so on, which did reggae and other Caribbean type music, but which was used, I suppose, extemporaneously to highlight the call for the 1.5 limit, which attracted a lot of attention from the corridors. So I would say yes, it certainly went a long way, and did provide the facilities for meeting and for discussing the text and for strategizing next steps as the negotiations unfolded.
I think we have just about 3 more minutes to answer one last question.
Sure.
As heavily, this would be
the last question.
Yeah. As heavily indebted countries, we have an interest in swapping debt for climate change. What scope is allowed for this under the agreement?
I don't think that there's a specific mention of debt swaps in the agreement, but that is usually a sort of more narrow bilateral issue, but not specifically mentioned in the agreement. But I know it has been discussed and it has been raised, and it's probably an issue that can be taken further. I know some countries have already, and in Central America, have started to look at this issue in a more serious way. So it's a conversation that I think probably would need to be had in the region.
Okay, thank you. So unfortunately, we are out of time. I would like to say thank you very much to our speaker, Mr. Kishan Kumar Singh, and of course to all of our participants, both online and offline, to our partners, and to our Caribbean Future Forum team. I think it was indeed an insightful session, and we can all take away little bits of advice from your presentation. Of course, please continue to follow and contribute to this discussion online at CaribbeanFutureForum.com. You can stay in the loop with what's happening by visiting our website, by liking our Facebook page, Caribbean Future Forum, and by following us on Twitter at Forum_Caribbean. Again, I want to say thank you and do enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.